Hello, glad you could join us. In this episode, we're discussing ESG, talent management, and your professional New Year's resolutions. Stay tuned.
The Institute of Internal Auditors presents All Things Internal Audit.
Hello and welcome. Here's some good news to start out the year. Internal audit's value is on the rise. A recent report to the influential G20 has positioned internal audit as a key component in 4 recommendations made by its Business 20 Integrity and Compliance Task Force. The B20 serves as the global business community's official G20 dialogue forum and formulates policy recommendations on designated issues. The IIA is a network partner to the Integrity and Compliance Task Force and has participated since January in formulating the recommendations presented at the B20 Indonesia Summit in Bali in November. Among the recommendations accepted by the G20 are specific policy actions that position internal audit as integral to promoting sustainable governance in business to support ESG initiatives, fostering collective action to alleviate integrity risks, refocusing on money laundering and terrorist financing risk factors identification, and strengthening governance to mitigate exacerbated cybercrime risks. Most impressive was the inclusion of the IIA's 3 lines model as an exhibit in the task force report, which cites, "The 3 lines model describes how the accountability of the governing body, actions by management, and independent assurance by internal audit provide the foundation for effective governance." If you've ever wondered whether ESG was just the newest buzzword or fad in corporate communications, here's a newsflash. It's real, and it's growing. A new survey from Deloitte finds that corporate response to environmental, social, and governance concerns from stakeholders is more than just a check-the-box compliance exercise. The survey finds 57% of executives indicate their companies have established cross-functional working groups to drive strategic attention to ESG. That's nearly triple the number who said so in a March 2022 survey. What's more, improved reporting on ESG metrics remains a high priority. Survey respondents identified a number of challenges, including 35% who say the greatest challenge is accuracy and completeness of data, while another 25% cited access to quality data. Shockingly, nearly all respondents, 99%, said they are somewhat or very likely to invest in additional technology and tools over the next 12 months to help address those challenges. Deloitte's Sustainability Action Report surveyed more than 300 executives in August and September 2022 at publicly owned companies with a minimum annual revenue of $500 million. The survey was supplemented by interviews of executives in various key sectors, including consumer products, financial services, life sciences and healthcare, oil and gas, and technology, media, and telecommunications. A link to that survey report will be in the comments section. As organizations are increasingly motivated to establish policies, processes, and internal controls that generate reliable information for ESG reporting and ESG decision-making, they need a reasonable ESG framework built on clear-eyed understanding of the issues. Yvette Connor, Strategic Risk Services Leader at Grant Thornton LLP, joins us to discuss this topic with the IIA's Robert Perez.
Hello, Yvette. Welcome. You presented at FSC on evaluating ESG governance and reporting. Part of your presentation focused on ESG frameworks and the status of the U.S. SEC's regulations pertaining to scoping of ESG governance. Now, that presentation was back in September of 22, and just a couple months after that, the SEC published a 4-year strategic plan on ESG. Now, I realize the plan is pretty high level, but how do you think this evolves the message that you shared at the conference?
I think that what we've heard from the SEC, and the signals have been loud and clear, is that something is going to happen. And through the commentary period that initially started, if you can believe it, in June of 2021, it was reopened again in October of 2022. They have had over 10,000 distinctive comments categorized into 4 different groups. And it's apparent to those of us that are following the process that there is a fair amount of contemplation and debate occurring about what does good look like in terms of how these regulations come to light. And in particular, just a quick refresh, these regulations are focused predominantly on climate. And my presentation at the FSC certainly covered ESG more broadly. But when we talk about the SEC in the US in particular, and the governance of US security laws, we are talking about a very strong set of signals that we have received that something is coming. And what we know so far to date is that what is coming is primarily focused on or leaning towards a principle-based approach to how climate risk will be reported by these public entities. And again, I continue to maintain the position that the SEC is very much leaning into this, subject to the comments they've received. And we'll be promulgating some rules, which we're now looking at late March, early April of 2023 as an approximate time period by which we start to see these rules take light.
At the top of this episode, we discussed the growing government pressures in the US and the UK, but you see this as a global trend, regardless of the framework chosen. Tell me a little bit about that.
I think that one of the things that I do regularly speak about is don't ignore what's occurring all around you, right? We shouldn't have this sort of myopic lens on US perspectives. And if we look across the pond, the Atlantic, what we know is that in the broader European Union and the regions thereof, there have been very progressive, and by that I mean sort of forward-looking conversations about how to achieve these 2050 carbon neutrality goals in a pretty effective manner. And they came out of the gate quick and strong, and they've continued to build. They were the first to launch our frameworks, many of which I discussed in my presentation, and they've evolved those frameworks. So we need to pay attention to that. And in particular, we know in fall of 2022, perhaps the most significant thing that happened in the EU was the promulgation of the CSRD framework, which is now live. And it does some pretty interesting things. It certainly addresses EU-based companies, but it also addresses non-EU-based companies subject to a set of filters or controls that say, if you meet these certain standards, you are going to be obligated to do X, Y, or Z in terms of your reporting to the EU. And again, that is for both public and non-public entities, which surprised some people. So I think we're going to continue to see the build and the rollout of that. And it is going to be a huge influencer globally, not just to the US and the SEC as they watch that happen and begin to refine their approach, but also over into Asia Pac.
So far, we've been talking a lot about the reaction to what's happening from a regulatory perspective, but you talk about the biggest challenge being establishing sound ESG governance. Tell me about that.
I've perhaps oversimplified here, but I talk about, how to think about the business problem at hand in really two dimensions. So the first dimension, which I would refer to as challenge number one, is predicated on this idea that ESG has this wide variety of metrics, some of which might be familiar and some which will be unfamiliar, in particular greenhouse gas reporting, potentially on value chain / suppliers. So that is a new nomenclature that folks are having to get their mind around. And in particular, the policies, processes, and internal controls that need to accompany those metrics. Again, some old, some new. So that's challenge one. Challenge two is, although there are some intrinsic similarities to financial reporting, which is great news for audit and internal audit, right? Feels very familiar. There are some data sufficiency challenges which bring the topic of assurance and the debate around assurance into the daylight and arguably create a concern. So let's assume that you feel pretty good about your metrics. And some industries do, by the way, more than others. But let's assume you feel pretty good about, hey, we have a good perspective on these metrics. And a great example, not surprisingly, of an industry that would feel this way tends to be the energy industry. So when you move that now down into challenge number two, all of a sudden that confidence tends to erode. And they say, oh, yes, we know what these metrics mean. We might even have policies, processes, and procedures that make us feel good about how we go and get the data, but we don't know if it's good data. We don't know if it's good data. Does that create an assurance issue for us? So those are the two primary and predominant challenges that we hear boards or I'll call it leaders, senior leaders in various businesses of all kinds discussing pretty regularly.
Does this relate to the two materiality concepts for sustainability disclosure?
Absolutely. So, we have materiality definitions under US security law. So again, I'm going to kind of bring it back into the US conversation. And as a publicly traded US organization, a corporation, you know what this means when we talk about materiality and going through the essence of your financial reporting. But when we talk about materiality concepts in sustainability disclosure, we have that and more. The same way we have metrics that are old and new. So when we put this all together, what we're talking about are these two overarching materiality concepts. The first and foremost, that's predicated on this financial reporting perspective that institutional providers and stakeholders, shareholders tend to rely on. But we have something much bigger than that. We actually have a materiality concept that goes beyond it. We have a materiality concept that says you are being asked to consider, to contemplate, and to describe what these significant impacts are from your business, right? On a first and third party basis, underpinning SEC rules, on a first and third party basis. Tell us how what you are doing could impact the economy, the environment, and person/people, and put that into a narrative. That's way beyond what we've been comfortable with for a long while. So that's why I like to draw a distinction. There's part of this that feels normal. And then you go, oh, we can do that. We can build on what we're already doing. It's probably achievable. But then we have this sort of enhancement bit of it where we have to think so much broader and strategically. And that's why some of the other parts of our discussion that I imagine we'll range into start to cover how we bring this all into a risk lens and leverage some of these existing risk management processes to help us out.
In part of your presentation, you discuss where organizations want to be with ESG reporting, but in our discussion so far, it's clear organizations feel that they're being told where they need to be. Is that necessarily going to create a conflict?
Absolutely, but I think we're going to see some evolution here, and I'm going to argue that's not a bad thing. In the comments that the SEC received, again, 10,000 plus, what we very clearly see is a trend around agility. And here's why. And doesn't this make sense? People are arguing for technology advancement, that how we see the world today and we're able to track, for instance, greenhouse gas, right, of all types. Our technology and ability to move into what we call carbon accounting and track that and pull that through and integrate it with existing accounting systems, existing risk management and GRC systems, it's going to evolve. It's probably going to get better. So why do we want to box ourselves in with absolutes when we're in a period of innovation? And the SEC has acknowledged that. Again, strong signals around principle-based approach, leaning on fundamentals of materiality, but embedding agility into the evolution of the regulation. So I don't think we're going to see these absolutes of the puck is going here and therefore you must be here. And instead we're going to go through this evolutionary innovation process. There's going to be these big, I'll call it jump moves where we embrace this technology that helps us do this better, that will then drive processes and skill sets into the equation. And we'll start to see organizations getting better overall at practicing the craft of what we're doing in these E, S, and G buckets and how to report out and how to do that with a level of assurance.
You make a strong case that ESG risk management succeeds when it's centralized and applied through enterprise risk management.
Let's actually lay this out. So a lot of organizations will have somebody running, I'll call it the sustainability function. Now they may have a focus on reporting, i.e. they are the individual or team responsible for producing the annual ESG and or sustainability report, right? So organizations have stood that up, especially the larger public ones. And in light of the pending SEC regulations, they're moving quickly on it. So that group has a component of strategy. That group has a component of reporting, but that group also has a component of risk management. So now the question is, how should they best engage risk management? Should they think of it more of like a first line operation where risk management's helping them think about policies, procedures, controls, and activities, and then the ESG sort of running as a first line to go do that body of work and do it well, with risk governance providing QA/QC over it? Maybe, right? But what we see more fundamentally, as I just alluded to in the insurance conversation, is the ESG group is not connected in with the chief risk officer and or risk group, at least not directly. They're not working as a team. And oftentimes internal audit's not at that table. So the three musketeers, I would argue, that you need to have, if you only picked three, would be to put the ESG team with the risk team, with the audit team, and treat it as a 3 lines of defense musketeer team, right? And now work together and say, all right, what data do we need? What metrics are we using? And run it through the way you would run a risk control self-assessment analysis that ultimately would flow into what? An enterprise risk analysis. So, wow, wouldn't that be efficient? And so instead what we find is that we have these separate little, patchwork pieces not coordinating. And then all of a sudden somebody says, wow, we want to pull, and I'll pick on a financial institution here because we see this happen. We have an ESG team and we want to be able to get ESG metrics out of our credit portfolio. What are we doing with our lending, right? And who are we lending to? And does that align with our ESG policy? And guess what? It's not connected. Chief credit officer, chief risk officer, ESG, internal audit, who's coming over the top of that third line, not connected. So I just tell folks that costs you money, right? That's not productive and arguably inefficient. And then I'll add one final point and allow you to pop in your next question. Let's go back to tech. Everyone I've just named, ESG, internal audit, risk, first, second, third line, they all have different tech. A lot of times they're not working on the same system. So what we've talked to folks about is how can you run an integration process? No one has to give up their tech. If you don't want to give up your tech, keep your tech. But how do you integrate the data to create a single source of truth? And how should you pull that together with your data architecture team and solve it? So these are two big themes that we've been talking about: integration and building upon what you're already doing in different parts of your business.
Any closing thoughts, Yvette?
One of the things that we say is that this is perhaps one of the most transformational things that has happened in business in a long while, where we're being asked to look at governance, report on governance, tell a narrative about governance in a more enhanced fashion. And, politics aside, if we just take it down to the fundamentals of transparency and materiality, and for shareholders to understand what the opportunities are, whether they're investing personally, whether they are looking at, if you will, principle-based investing as part of that approach to the marketplace, the ability to understand what an organization is doing and to have a level of confidence in the accuracy of how they're reporting it is truly transformational on these quote unquote ESG topics. Again, I'll leave you with this big idea. Sometimes we say it, maybe it helps people sleep a little better at night. ESG is probably, for the most part, a lot of the relabeling of enterprise risk management. And if you look in each of these ES and G buckets, you're going to find a lot of the stuff that you already know how to do. So don't get intimidated. Know that you have capability to execute. And now it comes down to what is the best pathway to execute and how do you optimize. Thank you again. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
New Year's resolutions. We've likely all made them for our personal lives. But what about our careers? At a recent IIA event, we asked attendees what their internal auditor New Year's resolution would be.
My New Year's resolution as an internal auditor is to become a certified internal auditor.
Stay focused on one task and try to really complete that as opposed to splitting resources amongst a bunch of different things at once. That would probably be my number one. And then also just to develop personally and more as a department and get back together now that things are starting to loosen up a little bit with the pandemic.
I think follow some other courses, go into more conference so I can develop my skills.
I want to work on my communication skills, like grow my public speaking better since I get a little too much nervous about it, so I want to work on that for sure.
I'm going to be more present in life, just enjoying moments. So that's a New Year's resolution. I feel like I'm all over the place at times, busy thinking about aspirations, but I kind of want to just enjoy the moment a little bit more.
So, a lot of internal auditors are resolving to grow their skills, which fits right in with our next segment, where our host Jamie Shine speaks with Ignite Conference presenter Diedre Melton about the opportunity for leaders to empower their team members to gain the soft and technical skills they need.
Hi, I'm Jamie Shine, Corporate and IT Audit Manager at Quick Trip, and I'm joined today by Diedre Melton, Associate Vice President for Audit and Chief Risk Officer at Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University. Thanks for joining me, Diedre. Your presentation here at Ignite covered a subject that is front of mind for most internal audit functions, building skill sets. Your presentation is titled Creative Ways to Grow Your Team's Skill Sets. How important is getting creative in the talent management process?
It is extremely important, especially when we are going through an unprecedented time where organizations are facing the challenge, not just retaining, but recruiting staff. And when they're recruiting, a lot of times they can't find the skill sets. So they're forced to try to build those skill sets in. So being able to be creative, because most organizations, let's face it, they're not funneling money to internal audit to increase their training budget. So you have to get creative with how you grow your team skill sets.
So another critical message in your presentation is about building that growth mentality or mindset. Can you weigh in on that a little bit?
Yes. So when I first started trying to grow my team skill set, my budget really hasn't changed for about 7 years when it comes to training. And I had a lot of new staff coming in, and I would send them to different trainings. I love the IA, so I'd send them to those trainings and other organizational professional trainings. And they'll pick up a little bit. But what I found was I had to empower them with that growth mindset. Once I kind of focused on that, then they kind of empowered themselves to grow, to reach out and really learn. And that's going from that fixed mindset of thinking that your intelligence is limited, that you can't do. And sometimes it's not their fault, right? Sometimes it's just how they grew up. We know everyone's diverse and their experiences differ. So you really have to focus on letting everyone know that we're a team, that we're going to collaborate, that challenges is something that we can overcome together and that they can grow. And so once they start getting into that growth mindset, learning and growing and increasing their skill sets, they're actively seeking that out, even when you're not encouraging it.
I love that. And a key word that you hit on there that I just love is empower. Empowering them to have that growth mindset. I think that's fantastic. Now, something else that you've talked a lot about is understanding and defining competencies. Do you mind sharing a little bit more about what that means and what that looks like?
Yes. So competency in its just plain state is just having the knowledge, skills, and abilities to accomplish something successfully. And the one thing about the IA, back in 2020, they released a new competency framework for internal audit. I love it. And one of the first things I did was I had all of my staff actually assess themselves against it. And the reason why is because this framework really outlines all the competencies your organization and your staff will need to be successful. And it goes from, hey, just having general awareness all the way up to what does it take to consider yourself an expert? And a lot of people was like, I kind of shy away from wanting to consider themselves an expert. And that's how you kind of go back to that growth mindset and merging the two. And by going through and finding creative ways just to go through each of those 4 categories within the IA's competency framework really will grow all of your skill sets for your team.
I think that's such a fantastic idea. I love that you had your staff actually go through the framework. And something that people may not know is that the framework is even free if you're an IIA member. So anyone can download it and use it as a free resource.
And it's great to build your annual training plan around. So that is one of the main reasons why I have them fill it out, because once they fill it out, then the next step is figuring out which things for that particular person they need to work on over that upcoming year so that they can continue to grow.
Now, in your presentation, you have some action items for each of those 4 components: professionalism, performance, environment, and leadership and communication. Do you mind telling me a little bit more about those action items?
So those action items, a lot of them are just really taking the time to learn what works best for your team. And so during the presentation, what I tried to do is to give you a variety, because all teams are different and all environments are a little bit different. So some of the things that I really hone on in is making it a team activity in all of those components. So for instance, during the session, I talked about using your team meetings as a growth opportunity, you leading sessions, inviting other leaders from your organization in to lead training sessions, or inviting other chief audit executives to come in and just lead sessions with your team, finding those creative ways to grow. I will tell you, one of the things I've done since I've been here today is just that. I've already recruited another leader from another organizations to come into my organization and teach them on different aspects of leadership.
That's so cool. And I think that's such a great opportunity too, being here in person at an IAA conference, the networking that you get to do. And that's such a great way to help your team build their skills.
Yes, and just going through the competency framework, one of the things that I think a lot of people don't take enough time on is the environment component. And really understanding the environment in which you work. And you can do that in so many ways. And some of the ways we talked about during the class was really inviting those leaders in, taking time to sit in around the table, go through your organization's strategic plan, sending people to the board meetings and reporting back, and asking yourself, what did they talk about that's going to impact this year's work plan? What are they talking about that's going to impact and change the organization long term? Because if you're going to add value to your organization, you need to be looking at those risks that's going to prevent the organization from adding value.
And you've hit on so many key points, but one of them I want to go back to is how you build the right skills, making sure that the skills you're building are the ones that are relevant. Now, you've defined a couple different categories, technical skills versus power skills. Could you weigh in on the technical skills first, what you think are the most critical?
So with the technical skills, there are a lot of technical skills as a person and for your organization you're going to want to focus on. The ones I go over are those that, regardless of your organization, these are the ones that's really driving the internal audit industry everywhere. So you have things like data analytics. Before, we've been hearing about data analytics for years. And those that's been in the field for a while, they're like, yeah, I'm just gonna have those newer folks. They'll learn some of the data analytics, or you've been hesitant. But at the speed at which organizations are changing, the speed at which, especially after the pandemic initiated, information is just more abundant. You have to get into learning data analytics and how to encompass that, because that leads you to the next skill set, especially technical, that you're going to need. You're going to need to move over into understanding artificial intelligence, because that's how you take data analytics and increase and get the power of predictive analytics to take place. Why would we want to do that as auditors in our actual shops? One is because you need to understand it to be able to audit the other parts of the organizations that's using it. But two, because we're always limited in our staffing, and it allows us to make a bigger impact, go through more data than what we can do using the traditional methods.
That's such a great point. Now, you've hit on some great technical skills. What about those power skills?
So I like to call them power skills. I know a lot of people are used to saying those soft skills, but for me, those soft skills, especially over the last 5 years, is what makes the difference between the doers within your organization and those who can truly lead. And so some of those power skills, as an auditor, you want to think about project management skills. And I like those. And one of the ways that I've really encouraged my staff to learn project management skills is bringing in those folks from our IT department. Most of them have project management certifications. And so I bring them in. One, it allows them to get to know other people within the organization. But two, I don't have to pay for that.
I love that.
But you want to have those basic project management skills, the same skills that they take to stand up a system to change how your organization works, are some of those key skills that can make your audit successful. Those basic skills transfer. Another one is just communication. Really teaching them how to communicate through report writing, through emails, in person, presenting. I always encourage my staff to really reach out and do public speaking, right? When we go into different meetings with clients, I do not lead those sessions. I may introduce and then I turn it over to them, getting them used to what does that look like? And we may have practice sessions before, but they really need to learn to communicate with all levels of the organization. And so I really try to put them in situations where they can gain that kind of experience. And being able to communicate effectively is really key, because one of the skills you really need to learn now is agile auditing. And it focuses on communication throughout the audit process.
I recently got to facilitate an agile auditing course, practicing agility, which is just that first bit. And it really hit home to me how important those skills are. So I love that you're doing that with your staff. You're such a thought leader.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today. I feel like we could stretch this out for a few hours because there's just so much insight in what you're saying. But thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. I know I'm inspired. I'm sure everyone else is as well.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me here today. I really enjoyed it.
And now for a bit of challenging fun we call In Focus. The 2023 edition of the Pulse of Internal Audit Report, created by the IIA, will be released this March. But here's a sneak peek at some compelling information it will feature. The IIA surveyed businesses regarding the percentage of internal audit work being done remotely. Here's the question. What percentage of respondents said that most or all their internal audit work was done remotely? Was it 21%? Was it 35%? Was it 42% or 58%? No Googling. We'll be back with the correct answer in just a few. Continuing now on the ESG theme, which, as stated, has become increasingly important for organizations with significant attention from multiple stakeholders, including regulators, rating agencies, investors, senior management, and the board. Coming up next, we'll join host Jamie Yang and get some guidance from Ignite presenter Sibasis Panda on devising an effective internal audit ESG strategy.
Hello, I'm Jamie Yang, and I'm joined by Sibasis Panda, Director of Internal Audit at Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. Today, we're discussing ESG strategy for internal audit. Sibasis, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Jamie. My pleasure. Just want to start the conversation by mentioning that even though I'm a director at CIBC, I'm not representing CIBC here, and the views expressed here are solely my personal opinion.
Sure, no problem. Thank you so much. ESG has become a major consideration for most organizations. Let's begin with a brief overview on what ESG is and some of the more recent developments.
Let me highlight some key issues in ESG. So as ESG, as you know, it's environmental, social, and governance. From an environmental perspective, it has definitely got a lot of media attention, and rightfully so. With environmental, you're talking about carbon emissions, net zero, so on and so forth. And organizations are increasingly starting to have their vision and target around net zero. Now, the next bucket is social. And this is an area which is also getting a lot of attention. With social, you're talking about things like employee diversity, equity, and inclusion, community relationship, product quality, and safety. And the last bucket is governance. In my view, this is the one which is a bit more on the matured side, just because companies have been exposed to corporate governance practices. The second part of your question was about relevant developments. There have been several developments. And if I had to highlight a couple, first would be regulatory developments. Tons of regulators are coming all over the jurisdictions with several developments on the regulatory space, be it the US SEC's proposed rules around climate disclosure, or even certain regulations that are already ineffective, such as the ones by the Bank of England Prudential Regulation Authority. That's on regulatory development. There have also been lots of developments by industry bodies, such as the IFRS Foundation creating its International Sustainability Standards Board. From a corporate standpoint, companies are increasingly starting to incorporate ESG factors as part of their incentive compensation process. And also there has been a proliferation of issuances of sustainability bond. Just from context perspective, the issuances of sustainability bond and other products was about $1 trillion in 2021.
So related to the regulatory piece that you mentioned, a lot of corporations are focusing on public reporting on ESG metrics. So why should an ESG strategy be focused on more than just reporting?
That's an excellent question. To me, the way I see it, reporting is ultimately an outcome or an output of all the activities that you're doing. So therefore, you should holistically define an audit strategy. And there needs to be certain foundational elements. In my viewpoint, there should be 3 foundational elements or 3 key pillars of an ESG audit strategy. First is establishing your audit universe and ensuring that it's comprehensive enough to cover all relevant process. The second foundational element would be having a well-established target operating model. And then the third pillar or the foundational element would be having ongoing monitoring or a continuous monitoring framework. That's how you create and develop your ESG audit strategy, and you're not solely focused on the reporting aspect.
Sure. So part of your presentation asks participants to identify potential ESG audit engagements. What kind of responses do you typically see?
And that was such an interesting exercise. And I had some polling questions on what are those engagements that they have specifically identified under E, under S, and G. And I was pleasantly surprised with the kind of response I got, and mostly positive. So going back to your question, on the E side, the engagements that my respondents provided were on environmental, on climate change, on net zero. And those are the ones that I would typically expect. On the social side, some of the examples or some of the audit entities that I heard were on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, product quality and safety. And on the G bucket or the governance bucket, I heard some interesting things on board diversity, but also pay equity. So these are some of the interesting areas that I heard from my respondents.
That is very interesting. Do your participants typically have a grasp on the ESG audit universe?
One of the questions that I ask my participants is, how ready are their organizations in the ESG reporting journey? And an overwhelming majority, I would say about 50 to 60%, have not yet issued sustainability reports. And that's just a reflection of the fact that that's why internal audit is still in its initial stage of its ESG journey, because management itself hasn't issued a sustainability report. However, in my presentation, I emphasize the fact that irrespective of whether an organization has issued or has not yet issued a sustainability report, internal audit can play a critical role. And I did lay out a foundation and a framework.
So one of those things that you've developed to aid internal audit shops in that is an ESG maturity assessment that runs from basic compliance to value creation. Tell me a little bit about that.
Maturity assessment, in my view, is just the starting point. And for maturity assessment, several frameworks have been proposed or developed by several consultants. And in my presentation, I used a framework provided by Diligent Corporation. And as you rightly mentioned, it runs from compliance to value creation. And that's why the first question that organizations need to ask themselves is, at what stage in the ESG maturity life cycle is the organization currently in? Are they in the compliance state, meaning the ESG processes are only geared to meet the minimum requirements stipulated by regulators? Or are they in the value creation, which is those organizations that are fairly advanced, fairly matured, and incorporating ESG process is just a second nature? But as I mentioned, that's just a starting point of determining ESG maturity assessment. Once you have determined your ESG maturity assessment, the next step would be to identify key focus areas. And some of the focus areas would be governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets, scenario analysis, disclosure, of course, industry standards and alignment with regulatory expectations. Once you have gone through a maturity assessment and identified your key focus areas, the next step would be to assess your audit universe to ensure it's complete. So that's the thought process of starting with maturity assessment and ultimately landing at completeness of the audit universe.
Great. Thank you so much for the comprehensive description. You mentioned before that there are 3 pillars, one of which is the operating model for managing ESG assurance. What are some of the key considerations?
The key considerations of the target operating model that I proposed, it's threefold. First is the team structure. How do you want your audit team to be set up? Do you want a dedicated ESG audit team, or do you want ESG champions in various individual audit teams? That's part of your team structure. The other category or the other bucket would be on your recruitment strategy. What kind of recruitment model do you want to employ as an audit organization? Do you want to hire individuals that have background in sustainability management and then bring them up to speed on internal audit concepts? Another approach could be have partnerships with academic institutions, and it helps build out your talent pipeline. And the third approach would be upskilling. It's absolutely important for your existing staff to be upskilled on ESG concepts. And that's where designations also come in handy.
Thanks so much, Sibasis. Can you further explain separating the internal and external monitoring?
There are 3 foundational elements. First is ensuring that your audit universe is complete, the target operating model, but just given all the rapid pace at which things are evolving, which I mentioned in my conversation with you earlier as well, it's absolutely important to have a monitoring mechanism. And with monitoring mechanism, it's 2-part. One is monitor the relevant developments within the industry as well as in your organization. And therefore, it's important to take a holistic approach for both internal monitoring and external. So with internal monitoring, there are a couple of options that can be used. First is internal audit should try to be on ESG committees of the organization, probably as an observer in an ex officio capacity, because you don't want to be part of management decision making. So that way your independence and objectivity isn't impaired. But also have the frequent touch points with your business partners to understand the key areas and developments within the ESG space in the industry, in the organization. But also review any relevant reports. That's your internal monitoring part. From an external monitoring, there are a couple of things that could be done. First is ensuring that you're attending webinars and conferences like the one that we are part of, where you get to interact with like-minded people, share ideas, get your thought process, but also monitor the regulatory developments. That's how you ensure internal monitoring and external monitoring.
Thank you for taking the time to discuss your presentation today with All Things Internal Audit.
Thank you very much, Jamie. My pleasure.
And now the answer to our In Focus challenge. The question was, what percentage of respondents to the Pulse Report questionnaire said that most or all of their internal audit work was done remotely? Was it 21%, 35%, 58%, or the correct answer, 42%? 42% of Pulse respondents said most or all internal audit work is done remotely at the time the survey was conducted. 58% is the result from the 2022 Pulse report, making it clear that 1 year later, remote work has tapered. For more insightful information on the profession, read the 2022 Pulse report at theiia.org and look for the 2023 edition this March. Thank you for joining us. Be sure to like, subscribe, leave comments, or a rating. If you'd like to enjoy an extended version of the discussions featured today, visit theiia.org, where IIA members get access to a longer version of this episode with more information and insights on ESG and talent management. For 43 years, the GAM conference has been the essential experience for audit executives seeking to be influential, indispensable, and informed. The IIA will be hosting the 2023 GAM Conference March 13th through March 15th in Dallas, Texas, and virtually, with a 3-day experience dedicated to internal audit's best and brightest thought leaders. IIA members save an extra $200 when they register by January 31st. To register, visit theiia.org/GAM. 2023 Fraud Virtual Conference, February 23rd from 10 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Don't miss your opportunity to explore the use of technology and data analysis methods to detect, prevent, and monitor fraud. Reserve your spot at theiia.org/fraud. Gaining and saving with your upskill plan. When you're making your plan to upskill your team, the IIA offers an array of group resources and training programs to meet your goals with savings. Learn more at theiia.org/group-training. Thanks for joining us for All Things Internal Audit from the IIA. We'll connect again soon.